So after that, I'd like to say, as an alumni, like, I am so grateful to be here. It has been so surreal to just like walk around Missouri State and get to be here in this kind of position, and it just makes me so happy. And this particular project was created here. Like, I'm at SLU now, but I wrote this here, I worked on this here, so I'm just very happy to be able to present it here. So I'll go ahead and get going with it. Yeah, I won't walk around a lot. I don't know what I'm doing with my hands. Okay, so I started working with with this collection, this library collection, when I was brought on to a cataloging initiative in 2014 between the JLM and the Missouri State University Special Collections and Archives Department, where we selected a representative cross-section of 100 books, and I forgot I had a PowerPoint. So, okay, so was working on a cataloging initiative in 2014, and we pulled a cross-section of 100 books, and just start cataloging. Most of them were in either Latin or Greek, and that's why I was chosen to help with that, because I had been studying that here. But this particular cross-section had 7 texts on subjects of the occult, several with marginalia that indicate their value to their owner. In working with these texts, I became interested in whether, by examining the marginalia and history of these books, we could capture the mental processes by which Thomas More Johnson was reading these texts on the occult. I wanted to try and understand the possible affect of the texts on the reader, especially considering how unique of a person Thomas More Johnson was. This study speculates. This is hypothetical. It's experimental in how he was reading these texts. But it's looking to answer what a well-respected 19th century rural Missouri lawyer possibly gained from books on the occult, and attempts to model a way to read marginalia in library collections such as these. I argue that the passages Johnson marked appear to be in response to loneliness. They show a preoccupation and a struggle with materialism, penance, and possibly feelings of desertion. Considering how isolating intellectual pursuits can be, as many of us know as academics, it can be very isolating, right? Like, you're constantly working on your papers in isolation, and he was an academic. I mean, he was constantly in isolation, as we know is common. And so I think an interesting part of this project has been how common the affect of loneliness is on the academic reader. And in the ways in which we can try to find connections to others with the same pursuits. I mean, just thinking about how we are networking here, because we all have these common pursuits. We probably often work in isolation, but then we come to conferences and symposiums and stuff to find that connection again. Or how academic Twitter is, right? Like, I mean, that's basically the same kind of way that he was corresponding with people as well, right? So to this end, the letters from the Johnson family collection that discuss his interest in the occult and occult books also show how important the physical text and written communication through correspondence and his participation in reading circles were for connecting Johnson to fellow intellectuals. So through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Johnson was a prominent Missouri attorney and notable figure in the local society. Johnson in 1915 was named Missouri's greatest man by then Lieutenant Governor William Roth Painter. What is less known about Johnson, well, until now in the symposium, is that he was also the president of the American Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, who only styled themselves in abbreviated form as the HBFL, an occult fraternity whose beliefs were rooted in the Jewish Kabbalah, Neoplatonism, and the ancient religions of Egypt, Greece, and Rome. The HBFL was interested in practical magic such as clairvoyance, use of magnetism, and speaking with the dead. Johnson spent most of what he made as a lawyer building his private library, despite his father early on attempting to dissuade him from spending so much time and money on, quote, musty volumes. Often his reading isolated him. Reportedly, quote, he was often regarded as a snob, since being both nearsighted and hard of hearing, as many of us academics are, he appeared to ignore people when he passed them on the street. he would still have been remembered as eccentric, for he would be observed twice a day reading a pocket-sized edition of some classical author as he walked to the express office to pick up some new books for his growing collection, end quote. And there's a bunch of like the little miniature books at the library and stuff, so like when I read this quote, all I could think of was my time at the library, like seeing all these really cool pocket-sized books. And just imagining him walking down the street like doing that. So a large part of the library was concerned with texts that influenced his philosophical interests and the HB of L. Eventually, primarily due to the urging of his wife, who was frustrated by the books overtaking his house, he built a new addition to his house where he would stay most of the time with his books. The traditional 19th century, oh, I should have turned that earlier. Anyway. The traditional 19th century farmhouse evolved into a labyrinth of twisting hallways that connected the book rooms and studies he built as the collection grew. Johnson spent his time with his books and barely would see his wife, something that may have added to his need to find connections through these texts and reading circles. However, Johnson was also frustrated with his inability to gain an academic position. An aside, which is something I think a lot of us now appreciate. Which he expressed this in a letter to a friend in 1892 that, quote, academic places are given not to merit but to push in foreign degrees, end quote. Such frustration could have only added to his feeling of isolation from more traditional academic networks of scholars and like-minded readers, turning him towards spiritualism and that community. In a 1963 monograph on Midwestern Platonism, Paul R. Anderson includes a chapter on Johnson, which proclaims Johnson as, quote, of the Midwestern men who made a contribution to philosophy, Johnson was the greatest scholar and bibliophile, end quote. Anderson focuses on Johnson's interest in Platonism, his frustrated academic status, and his collection of books about which Anderson states, Johnson's own library of classical sources was almost unrivaled in the entire country. Surprisingly, Anderson never mentions the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, and argues, based on Johnson's own periodical publication, The Platonist, that Johnson's interests in the occult were only commercial. The Platonist was Johnson's periodical he published from 1880 to 1890 that include many modern translations of Greek philosophical works. Many of the letters, including those from India and Europe from the Johnson family collection, are concerned with subscriptions to the Platonist or mention the Platonist. Anderson asserts that Johnson was unhappy with the reach of the Platonist and only included the occult works for the sensationalism needed to attract a wider audience. However, considering his involvement in occult groups, as has already been discussed today, I think we can ignore that theory. So part of my study is looking at the texts these occultists studied. And by doing so, hope that we will be able to better understand the mental processes, motivations, and struggles these occultists went through, and possibly what attracted them to that community. In the 19th century, occultists, especially practicing occultists, would have faced isolation and the need to hide from mainstream society, or at least hide their activities from mainstream society. This particular study, by examining an occultist isolated in a rural setting, looks at how important text and writing was to maintaining relationships and connections across occult and philosophical reading circles and correspondence. Robert Darnton, an early proponent of the importance of studying marginalia, poses two key questions that define the connection point between the study of marginalia and textual analysis. Quote, how can we capture the mental processes by which readers appropriated texts? How can we avoid anachronism, the fatal sin of most historical research, end quote. In the spirit of Darnton's questions, the study will examine closely the marginalia and history of several occult-rated books in Johnson's collection. When these marginalia are examined in the light of Johnson's history and knowledge of his activities, we can see how they reflect the inner conflict that was created by his need for community. Johnson was not only an outsider in the small Midwestern town of Osceola, but also in his own home, arguably where his wife did not share the same affinity for his books, and his father had even shown a frustration with his love for books. So isolating him from that traditional family structure and pushing him into the book house. So the passages that have marginalia depict an interest in, I said, like flesh, marriage, penance, and feelings of desertion. And this may show how Johnson's interest in occult groups may have been caused more by his need for community than by his belief in ancient religious movements. That is arguable. But And that he was struggling with repressing feelings of loneliness that stemmed from both the internal issues at home and the external lack of a traditional intellectual community. So since Darden's essay, there's been a rising trend in book history for examining book marginalia in an attempt to construct an understanding of how the reader perceives a text. This trend reflects the increasing availability of and access to physical artifacts through digitalization. Scholar Robert Hoffman lists the reasons for marginalia to comment, translate, agree, argue with, etc. He discusses the difficulties in interpreting such marginalia as underlines, abbreviations, and symbols, all of which are seen in the Johnson collection. So like many of them are just symbols or underlines or markings, which are especially difficult to translate or to interpret. But so many of us do that if you mark in your book. Like, I'm a huge marker in my books, so like I'm constantly underlining that. Like, who knows what they're going to think in the future? What I thought, but so all of these are seen in the Johnson collection. But there's been a modern discouragement of writing of books, and Hoffman cites H.G. Jackson's work on romantic readers' marginalia, representative of a time when readers were encouraged to annotate, as a way to dialogue with not only the author and the text, but also with their reading circles. And that's something that I would eventually want to take this on more, is like, how many of these annotations had more to do with the reading circles, and were they actually in some sort of communication through that? Because they definitely did share books at times, and there was that possibility that this is communication between them. So letters written to Johnson also show that he had these reading circles, a network of correspondence about books, and the network shared these books from the occult with one another through the mail. A prolific author of marginalia studies, H.G. Jackson argues that marginalia are not merely incidental, but are useful details needed for this close study of literature and history. Jackson states that the future of the field depends on scholars' further study of marginalia and, quote, taking up opportunities to add new kinds of data and new models of analysis as they present themselves, end quote. So the analysis offered in this study ideally will add to the field of marginalia studies by showing through textual analysis the mental processes behind a man's actions and interests in this occult fraternity while living in rural Missouri during the spiritualism movement in 19th century Midwest America. So, the HBFL, unlike the more well-known secret societies of the time, such as the Freemasons, taught practical occultism that involved seances, crystals, drugs, and sex. In fact, it appears that the HBFL viewed Freemasonry as a weak attempt to renew occultism. Freemasonry was acknowledged as part of the historical tradition that included Hermeticism and Buddhism, but did not teach the occult. The HBFL saw the Freemasons as a business and to institutionalize, like their views of the Christian church, which I think shows kind of like their isolation from these more mainstream groups and accepted institutions like the Freemasons and the church. According to the HBFL, pledged the initiate, quote, promise to hold sacred and inviolable all teachings, rules, signs, and symbols received from my occult teachers, and to fulfill all the commands of my duly appointed guru relating to occultism, end quote. The HBFL not only discussed the occult from a philosophical perspective, but also sought to teach it so that the members could practice the occult and communicate with the different circles of existence. The internal circle when alive and the external circle when dead. The exterior circle is the plane that living humans are on, while the interior circle is the plane where adepts that are both living and dead can meet. By using clairvoyance arts, adepts could communicate between planes. The evidence of some of the documents found suggests that sexual activities were part of this communication or communion with other planes. This view of sexual activities and interplane communion would have affected the view and practice of adepts' relationships with non-adepts. So like between husband and wife, I'm assuming there may have been some issues if this was followed. So a series of documents found in Johnson's collection instruct readers on the possible errors, but also use of sexual intercourse by the initiates of the HBFL. The handwritten instructions disclose how sexual intercourse between the adepts is necessary for the procreation of souls, not merely children, as seen in the gloss on this on a passage in chapter 3. When mankind shall truly understand the mystical laws of sex, they will be able to realize any ideal in their children by bringing forth gods instead of men. Okay, so the text further notes that this sexual union must be between initiates in order to realize this evolved soul. This union was not meant to bring power from the outside spheres for the initiates having intercourse, but to create the other soul and to give it power. According to these instructions, it was an error to try to bring oneself power through these unions by the force of will, Such a goal would only bring harm. One text notes how the members are emphatic that power in magic is a product not only of will, but of love and the feminine side of the soul, rather than of the cold, dispassionate intellect. These ideals of love and warmth versus dispassion and coldness could have been a prime attraction to an isolated man like Johnson, arguably isolated from both other intellectuals and possibly from his own home. The HBFL had a short-lived public history, although based on the letters in Johnson's collections, the members did not stop communicating. The fraternity only went underground after a loss of momentum due to the uncovering of Burgoyne's past advertising fraud in England. And the foundation of the group was weakened. The group eventually dissolved, and although Johnson's letters show that his interest in the occult continued. Although, as mentioned earlier, Anderson does not mention Johnson's occult connections, he does discuss Johnson's collection of Platonist and philosophical works on subjects that influenced the HBFL. In addition, Anderson makes the argument that Platonism was vitally important to Johnson. This has already been obviously discussed today. That Platonism was an authoritative body of truth, not just another cult, but the final cult for Johnson. So his interest in the occult and the HBFL, in fact, appears to be primarily influenced by the lack of community to share in his philosophical interests. Anderson explains that Johnson attempted to create a philosophical club in Osceola, but eventually gave up when he realized the members were not at all of his intellectual caliber and unable to provide him with the level of intellectual community he craved. Johnson's frustration with his limited opportunities for intellectual stimulation in Osceola may explain his considerable involvement with both the Theosophical Society and the HBFL. The occultist world was a small one, and most occultists belonged to multiple societies at the same time and would have been familiar with one another. By 1886, many of the members of the American Board of Control of the Theosophical Society, including Johnson, joined the HBFL, and Johnson became president. Johnson's position as a leader in the HBFL is further asserted in his sigil, a sign or symbol that is often considered to have magical powers. Several of the letters show that sigils were used as code names for various members of the order. The published collection of documents on the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor posits that a letter from Burgoyne concerning the initiation ritual is to Johnson because it makes sense that Johnson, as president of the American chapter of the order, would have that sun sigil. In a letter to Johnson, this is affirmed since Burgoyne addresses a letter to Johnson with the sun sigil and sends it with his own, which Burgoyne's was a swastika. Despite Johnson's leadership position and the geographical distance, the letters from the various members carry a feeling of brotherhood and community. They write warmly referring to each other as brother or bro, and I'm not sure they pronounce it that way, but I'm going to. And signing often, fraternally yours. Letters from various HBFL members, Theosophical Society members, and others interested in the occult reveal how Johnson, someone who did not like to travel but still craved communication with like-minded men in his circle, built his philosophy and occult library through correspondence. These letters mention specific books about the occult or promise lists of books. One letter writer thanks Johnson for lending a book to him and promises he will mail it back soon, implying a sort of lending library system amongst these correspondents. Some of the letter writers are book dealers or printers. These letters show a writing web of community that Johnson built for himself through his philosophical, occult, and reading interests. So on to the actual survey. So out of that 100 books, in this kind of like pilot cataloging program in 2014 that got started here, 7 are on topics clearly of interest to the HBFL. There are more works out of, so the other 93 are very connected to the philosophical things and still tangentially related to what would have been of interest to the HBFL, but these 7 were just so clearly connected that it made sense to do in this kind of like smaller post-study. Out of these 7, 4 have marginalia and are the primary focus of this study, but there were also these 3 that don't have marginalia, but like they had to be talked about in light of that, because one of my questions would be, why don't these have marginalia? And I don't get into that in this study. Clearly this needs to be a bigger study to figure out which books have marginalia, why they have marginalia, why they don't have marginalia. One theory that I had is that 2 of these that were published in London, so they're in English, the Private Instructions in the Science and Art of Organic Magnetism and the Unheard of Curiosities one, are both in English and they don't have marginalia, and I'm wondering how, like if a broader study was done, how many more texts that are written in a different language have marginalia, because that, like, when you're translating, it actually encourages you to make more notations in your books because you're going through the process of translating while you're reading it. But one of these 3 books, without marginalia, which is in Latin and from the 17th century, so the Metaphysicae Platonic, my Latin pronunciation is horrible, even though I can translate it, has the Leipzig bookseller and antiquarian work of Heinrich J. Naumann. And since Naumann died in 1893 and was primarily based in Dresden, it appears that this may have been a later purchase through the Leipzig branch by Franz Schurich. And another of the texts that does have marginalia, Steganografia, has a loose leaflet in the back. That is the ad for the book from E.P. Goldschmidt and Co. And the dates for that bookseller is 1887 and 1954, and would place the books purchased by Johnson somewhere in the late 19th century, but most likely in the early 20th century. Out of these 7, 2 were purchased from booksellers overseas and across decades, showing not only Johnson's continued interest in the occult after the H.G. Wells collapse in the late 1880s, but also his continued effort in acquiring these texts, which is why the booksellers were important to me. It's like, was he continuing to do this even after the collapse of the H.G. Wells? So these 3 books without marginalia, The Unheard of Curiosities, was written by the same author, Jacques Scaffarel, who wrote one of the texts with marginalia, the Abdita Duane, which I find interesting. Like, why did he choose one of these texts over the other one to write in? But one was originally published in French and was translated, and so that could possibly be why that one doesn't have the marginalia in it. Johnson's edition was the first English translation of the text by Edmund Chilmead and was published in London in 1650. It contains 2 folding plates with Hebrew characters, one of which is titled The First Table of Celestial Constellations, expressed by Hebrew characters, and the other the Celestial Hebrew Alphabet. Another book without marginalia is Metaphysicae Platonic by Andrea Kessler, published in Wittenberg in 1648. This is the one that has the book plate that was mentioned in the previous section that shows the bookseller. I'm going to skip this section because I have 10 minutes left. Or wait, how much time do I have left?
You can have 5 more.
I got 5 more minutes?
If you want to.
Okay, so I'm going to skip to the ones with the definite marginalia. God, I talk slower apparently than I thought I did. So books clearly with Johnson's marks. There are two that are in certain marginalia. Arguably somebody else wrote them, or wrote in them, and that's this one, which is about geomancy, which is super cool. But there are all these like pen marks in it, and these like quotation marks next to it. There's no way to be sure that Johnson did them, but it's interesting to see that in his collection he has these books with these various notations, right? And then there's this one on the Kabbalah that has these very particular markings and writings in a different color ink, which is where my suspicion comes in that it might not have been Johnson. But would be definitely interesting to go through and do a very in-depth study of like why these particular sections and what does that say about, because whoever owns this book is going to be looking for particular things, you would think. But moving on. So the first one of the books clearly with Johnson's marks are the Steganografia, which is from 1608, or this edition is from 1608, and that's the study of coded languages. So this work is in Latin and was published in 1608 in Frankfurt, Germany. It includes instructions on the key to Steganografia. 2 interesting aspects of this text are the plethora of handwritten notes on the cover and frontispiece, which is what this is. Johnson also wrote his name on the first recto page, and underneath added the date, November 18th, 1884. I'm going to skip the description of this. So, there it is. Okay, so this work has what to me was some of the most fascinating of the notes. There's pics written, if you can see it. Here, I'll use the mouse. So like right over here, it's like PIX. That's written, and it has several places that this happens. So it's also on this next page. So I'll just jump to where I talk about that. So on page 18, he starts with this, 24, 36, and 37. But it's in pencil, there's underlining, and there's this note here. And I was not entirely sure, I'm still not entirely sure what pix means, but one theory is that it comes from the Latin, and which comes from the Greek, which it could either mean box, and that's where there was this idea that it was actually the Eucharist, like the box of the Eucharist, that sort of thing, the box of the host. Or it could have meant pitch, tar, resin, which, if the meaning is pitch, it means that it's meant to obscure. It could mean to obscure or to defile. That is some of the side meanings etymologically toward that. And these particular passages have to do with being vigilant so that you are not overcome by the flesh. So he was looking at texts and possibly marking them if you're analyzing the etymology of this word. This is pix in that sense, and marking it for how being overcome by the flesh can be defilement. So another marked passage concerns subduing hunger for things of this world. So fighting against materialism. So fighting against the flesh, fighting against materialism, and considering death as a forsaking of vanity.
Do 5 minutes.
Okay. So that's the most interesting part of that particular text. And just to kind of add to that, there's this ideology that was discussed by the members of anti-clericalism and anti-materialism. So in this one letter written by Elliot Page, he wrote, "I cannot cease to wonder at the bias which leads thinking men to wind up the one little precious kernel of truth in the mummy plots and bondages of modern theology. For of course we must recognize that however much they distort in the form of pure truth, we can at times detect an inkling of it, even in the utterances of some of these later-day saints and apostles, will have it that there is but one path to what to me savors very strongly of being an utterly material hereafter." So there's all these messages against materialism, which one of the things that I wondered with that is how much was this fight against materialism a struggle for somebody who is living in as the head of a household, who is having to be the breadwinner, right, and actually think about material things like paying rent, or well, not paying rent, but I think about paying rent, but owning that house, giving his kids clothes, and he's struggling possibly or wrestling with this idea of personally wanting to fight against materialism, but with his beliefs, having to also take care of his kids and his home, and so going back and forth between the expectations of being a 19th century lawyer and wanting to follow this philosophical way. So I go on forever about that. I'll skip to the next book. So just to finish up, I keep pushing on. So that's more than pix, actually. So it's here again, closer up here. So that particular book is really interesting to look through for that. So in the Vita Duane Kabbalah Mysteria, which was written in Latin and published in France in 1625, and it was a defense of the Kabbalah against sophist attacks. This one, there are not as many markings as in the Steganografia, but there is in the back a vertical line that dates it for 1872, so I think this is one of the earlier ones he possibly had. And then on page 48, it shows that the corner was marked or folded over to mark that section. On page 49, the lines, both those underlining the text and vertically on the page, are mainly double lines. However, some of the textual ones are single. And that's the subject of that section is on good and evil, and whether, since God is the creator of evil, evil is a form of good. The underlined sentences state that God is doing good, at least in the form of good, when evil is created out of nothing. However, nothing is formally evil, according to the ancient philosophers, since by doing good or the form of good can create evil. And these lines appear to have meant something for Johnson, and they have significance as an indication of his struggling with that inner turmoil and being a cultist in this very Christian area of the country. And these lines depict how he was attempting to make sense of the concepts of good and evil, and perhaps explain how something that might be perceived as evil, like the occultist rituals, might have actually been good, and that question of good versus evil. So then the next marks show that Johnson may have been struggling with feelings of abandonment, and so like that's this one, the farther one, yeah. So that's the scene. That's from the scene of Jesus' death in the book of Matthew. My God, why have you forsaken me? And a reference to David's Psalm 22 that laments his feelings of desertion by God. And that to me could also speak to perhaps like his father's like frustration with his love for books and having to live with that and deal with that, along with the communities not appreciating it. So to finish up, this study hopefully demonstrates really, I think, the importance of continuing to look at this collection in this way. This is just a brief master's student's attempt to start reading through these and figuring this out. But this is really a treasure trove, I think, of marginalia studies. So if anybody wants a project to work on, there's a wonderful collection for you to go play with. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. This is a fascinating snapshot of a fascinating project, and I think I can actually answer a couple of your questions. But before I try to do that, I wanted to open this up for questions from the audience or comments. Beta, please.
Yeah, so Natalie, are you able to read what is written above 1872?
Circa 13th of June.
Okay.
Oh, circa 13 June. CA. Oh.
I mean, that's my guess, unless that means California, but I seriously doubt that.
What was the criterion by which these 100 were selected?
At the time, I was working with Dave Richards, and the idea was to find the oldest ones we could in an initial hunt out there for them. I don't think we got all the oldest ones. I think some of the older ones were actually in hiding. But that's why so many of these are 17th century, because that was our main goal, was to find those, get them as old as possible, clean them up and stuff like that, and just start playing with them.
Any other question, comment? Yeah, as we mentioned, there's actually at least a couple of 1500, late 1500 books and some 1600 books that at least I have are in the catalog. I've seen actually some of them. We may get a chance to see some of them tomorrow. So as to your questions, I think there's a couple that I may attempt to answer. And those have to do with why the marginalia on one of the Gaffarel and not the other. Okay, so I'm also looking at, actually, I have not seen the original of this, but Johnson, as we know, became interested in Kabbalah, but he became interested in Kabbalah particularly through the mediation of Eliphas Levi, who was this mid to late 19th century French occultist. Is sometimes called the last of the Christian Kabbalists and the first of the occultist Kabbalists. And the one article that Johnson wrote for the Platonists on Kabbalah is essentially a combination of two sources, Christian Ginsburg's Kabbalah and Eliphas Levi's English translation of, the translation of some of Eliphas Levi's French work, which was at that time appropriated by the Theosophical Society, and Johnson got to read it, and he was very involved in this work. So Eliphas Levi had a list of books that he deemed crucial to Kabbalah. If you want, he writes in one of the books that Johnson quotes and references in his own notes on Kabbalah in the Platonists. If you want to learn about Kabbalah, these are the books and the authors that you have to read. And basically, lo and behold, all of the Kabbalistic books that I've been able to see in the various partial catalogs of the Johnson Library are indeed all of the books that Eliphas Levi listed as being important. So the Artis Kabbalistice here is one of those, and there's a reference to Raymond Lull as possibly the first Christian in the 13th century already being interested in appropriated Jewish Kabbalah. Clavis here may be a reference precisely to Eliphas Levi reading of this as a key for the tarots and how to use them. So this particular book was recommended by Levi. The other one by Gaffarel was not. So that's one. I think that's pretty much that's pretty much the, I think, so I think, you know, in this particular case, it may have to do with the kind of stuff specifically related to Kabbalah that Eliphas Levi had recommended and that Johnson acquired and eagerly read, in part because he used some of it to write his own article on Kabbalah for the Platonist, versus other things that he may have acquired but they were not part of that recommended book list, so to speak. So that's my kind of educated guess there. But, I would like to see them at some point. Yeah.